each other. So I say to a semiotician, as a dialogue, I say, okay, I see that you think of the world in terms of symbols that have meaning. Now, in a dialectical point of view, I say, well, that means that you don't see this. I challenge it. I say to it, I say, you need to come my way, because you're weak here. You don't see what I see. You think it's all about, the meaning of words, but I think it's about how the social, how those words are delivered. So I'm in tension with you, and we're struggling over something. So those of you who've studied Marxism, right? You have a thesis, you have an antithesis, you have a dialectical tension, then you have a synthesis that becomes a new thesis, antithesis. So everything evolves out of tensions. And so Craig wants to put these traditions together so that they can pull against each other and have criticisms of each other and say, well, then what about this? And what about that? And what are you going to do about this? My field explains it better than your field does. My tradition explains it better than your tradition does. So then what we end up with is communication theory then has some coherence for Bob Craig, because it becomes a way in which we as communication theorists dialogue and dialect around these different points of view.
So would there be no compromise in dialect?
Well, no, dialectic in general means that the tensions remain unresolved. So there is a theory of interpersonal relationships called relational dialectics. That is a theory of human relationships that says people are always in a constant negotiation and struggle between togetherness and apartness, and between openness and closedness. And so your relationship is always somewhere moving, and you want to be closer to your partner, but they don't want to be that close, but they don't want to be far, so you're in this constant movement. Everything is always moving. Yeah, so I don't know that it's a battle with an end and a winner and a loser. I don't think that's the way we go at it. We go at it as a constant, and as we dialect, that's the way, I forget what the theory is called, but, that this is the way progress takes place, through the dialectic of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So it's a sense that we will progress in this field as we engage each other in tensions over our different perspectives. And this is only just starting in Bob Craig's world, because we've just begun to practice the field in this way, with implications for the practice of communication. So that's, we'll come to that theme. The goal is, there it is. The goal is a dialectical coherence. Not a unified theory, but I guess, Lisa, that's his answer to your thing. No theory emerges from the pile, the scrum with the rugby ball. It doesn't work that way. But rather a debate about the practical implications of different theories. And Craig is intent on pragmatics and practical thing, because he says communication theory emerges from everyday problems and the way people talk about them, and we then theorize all that stuff, and it needs to come back and change practice. Distribution principles. Okay. Now, this word is a little tough. Okay. The idea of constitutive communication is maybe the simplest way to say it is this: that the thing is not out there to be discovered, but that we create the thing. So Daniel Bornstein I don't know if any of you have read his books. He was a historian. He wrote a book called The Discoverers about Magellan and Ponce de Leon and all of these people who were discoverers and how they went out and found things. And he wrote another book called The Creators. And this was about artists, authors, people who created things that did not already exist. And so for Craig, the point is not to go out and discover somewhere in the world what communication theory is, but for us to create it. And in the creating of it, it takes on an existence. That's an inadequate explanation of what constitutive means, but it's getting at. Does anyone want to take a shot at what constitutive means?
Something that's fundamental.
Fundamental.
Constitutive, like a constitutive act, like say for, it would be the same as for a country or a state, a constitutive act.
Yes, so the Constitution creates the state. Yeah, so the state didn't exist, and we didn't discover it. We created it through our acts, right?
So a fundamental idea or act that permits things to evolve around it, maybe like a center.
Okay, right. So this model then, for Craig, to use that analogy, this model is like the Constitution of the United States. It calls into being and forms the field of communication studies, right? So yeah. But we realize it's a human construction. That becomes very important in this.
But would
Go ahead.
like the rivers and stuff, would visible things have to be the human construction? Like, you don't understand the physical thing until it's found or like discovered? Or would it just be like theoretical things? Like, would you apply that, like if you found like a new element or something,
Right.
would it be that you can't understand it until it's discovered, so it doesn't like in your mind exist until you find it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's part of what this is. This is more about how do we create a field of communication studies, you know, and some fields like biology want to go out and discover the way the world is, you know, that there are these biological processes and these elements that combine in these chemistry, these combine in this way. Well, humans and communication is way more complicated than that. So
I think maybe for a constitutive model or an idea, you have that intentional dimension that lacks when we're discovering certain things. So something maybe with a purpose.
a human intention and a purpose, yeah, behind it. Yeah. What you're talking about is a whole theory about the relationship of language to the world. Worf hypothesis, that until we have the language, we cannot, it doesn't exist for us. Yeah. We'll talk about that. Well, another way to think about constitutive is the old question about organizational communication. Do organizations have communication, or are organizations communication? So does an organization, one way to look at organizational communication is to say, here's an organization, and communication takes place within it. Another way to say is, an organization exists in the communication. It is its communication. It is constituted by its communication practices. So if you change the communication practices, you change the organization. So the organization doesn't exist separately from the communication. That gets at it again. It is the communication, is what the organization is. It is constituted, reconstituted, produced, reproduced by its communication. So we'll come back at this. Other points. And then, so theory as meta-discursive practice. Doesn't he have great words? This is just so great. Just go home and say, I was thinking about some meta-discursive things today. Meta-discursive. So discourse is us talking to each other. Meta-discourse is us talking about how we talk to each other. It's a meta step, a step up. So there's even meta discourse, which is the discussion about how we talk about communication. That'll fry your brain to try to get there. So theory of communication is talking about how do we talk about groups, how do we talk about conflict, how do we talk about signs and symbols. Okay, so this gets at it. The common social reality we live in, not the physical reality. I mean, a desk is a desk whether you call it an apple or an orange or a desk. It exists. But the social reality that we live in is constituted by the language and the way we talk about things. So if we talk about a group of people in a certain way, we call into existence the prejudices and relationships that are going to exist. If we change that way of talking about them, we change their physical experience of life because we treat them differently. So this is where politically correct speech was very much an attempt at social transformation. How do we change the condition of marginalized and oppressed groups? Well, we order people to stop using certain language. And as people change that language, the social world will change and the social conditions will change. So this is a perspective on the relationship between language and reality. Child abuse is an example of this. There was his time when child abuse did not exist. Okay. Now, what am I saying? Am I saying that there never was a time when kids were mistreated and, subjected to abusive? No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that the concept of child abuse didn't exist for a long time. And so the people didn't name it. And now a whole industry exists around child abuse. Because we created a language and then reshaped, having that language then reshaped all kinds of things. And this happens in many different situations, where we create new language which then reshapes the social world that we live in. Anyone have another example? There are a lot of examples of new things that we just create by talking about them, and then.
Yeah, I've said it myself when I've talked about some habit that I've just always have. I'll say, it's hardwired.
Okay.
It's on my hard drive. There's nothing I can do about it. That's just the way my brain goes. But it struck me the other day 10 years ago.
Yeah.
It made any sense at all.
Well, the phrase, "This is just who I am," is a social construction. Yeah.
Soccer moms.
Yeah, soccer mom. And so we name something that already existed, but we give it a new conceptual meaning, and a whole world creates around it. Yeah. My identity.
Do you think that things like by getting rid of certain words, like you're saying that to change it, you get rid of certain words?
Right.
Do you think that
Ever works?
Yeah.
Well, I'm pretty sure it does. Yeah. That if you stop talking about a group of people a certain way, Yeah. Well, look at the whole feminism language issue, right? I mean, that's part of it. You know, male man. You know. What's that? Yeah, the whole movement to gender neutral. Has that changed anything in society? Well, probably it has. Yeah.
And it's changed the thinking. I mean, it's just, you know, guys like from my dad's generation, you know, I mean, it's creaking slowly.
Yes, yes.
But it's on their radar, you know, another expression.
There we go, yeah. So we constitute a common reality. We say there are things like child abuse, there are soccer moms, people have identities, you know, and so all of a sudden that's the way it is. And we have conferences on identity and social workers about child abuse. And so we create the social world through the language we use.
Well, even the whole idea, I guess, of being politically correct, that I
Right.
think is something that's kind of established out of our, desire to get rid of gender neutral terms or
Yeah.
racism.
And there are universities have speech codes. You know, they have rules about professors talking about stuff. And what kind of language you may use, what kind of language you may not use, what kind of words you may use.
Because I know in publishing that's the case.
Yeah.
There's certain terminology that you should use when speaking about racism.
No, we have APA too. APA as a whole, it's not just about how wide the margins are. It's about how you address people, gender, all kinds of things. Yeah. So some people, as they have studied Craig's article, have said, well, you're playing two ways with the word constitutive. So one way is that this model founds a field, and then you're jumping into the social construction of reality. So they've pointed out that they feel like Craig is playing a little fast with both things. So that's just to show you that Craig has been criticized. So this is not, uncriticizable. So we're stuck here in the sense that it's impossible to talk about communication without using communication. So, you're kind of in a loop using the thing to talk about the thing. So when we talk about it, we shift it, and then that shifts what we talk about. So. Right, so we create a field that we call communication by talking about it a certain way. See, a model is a certain way of describing what's going on. So when you say that public opinion is formed by people who are afraid to voice their real opinions for fear they'll be isolated. That's a model. But if you go into meta models, you talk about, okay, so that's a perspective that talks about people's psychology as the reason for their communication behaviors. So it's a meta model. Now we're going to step outside of the model and talk about what kind of a model that is. So we'll do both things in this class. We'll talk about models of communication, and we'll talk about meta models of communication. So within socio-psychological, there are a bunch of models of what's going on. But as a whole, there is a approach that is psychological or cultural. Right. So Craig here is trying to get at the fact that before you ever heard that there was a course in communication theory, you would say to people, would you explain that to me? You know, so you were doing theory, it just wasn't codified into a scheme and in a field. So you are practicing a kind of talk about talk. When you say, you watch two people have a fight and you say, what went on there? You don't want to know, you don't want someone to repeat their vocabulary. You want someone to step up from that and say, all right, what's going on is this and this and this and this and this. And they're reacting and he's being defensive and she's avoiding, and so you talk about all those things. So it's rooted in people's practices. All right. Right. So practical talk, or the practice of talk, is, well, what happened there? I don't understand. Oh, she's being defensive. He's being avoidant. Okay. Theory is more systematic than that. It demands a little more rigor, a little more critique, but it grows out of everyday problems. So Craig wants us not to go off into some cloud land where we're talking about, he makes a stab at epistemology in his article. And so he's kind of poking at people who get really philosophical about, and it's totally unpractical what they do. They're arguing about what are the sources of knowledge and how does knowledge come about? How can we know anything? You know, it's kind of like what you do as a freshman, you know, and you sit around and you argue about, do we really exist, or are we a dream in someone's imagination? You know, Craig's like, let's forget that. We got practical things to do around here. So. Theories of hermeneutics are systematic. Yeah. Hermeneutics. Any Greek scholars? Hermes. Who was Hermes? Messenger of the gods. Mercury. Hermes. So hermeneutics is the study of divine messages, or what does this mean? You know, the gods explaining life to us. So when we try the hermeneutics, just think of trying to make sense of something, and what does this mean? So if you were to be a person who studies ancient texts, you would be practicing hermeneutics, trying to understand, what did this author mean by this phrase? What did Milton mean when he said these things? Because we don't understand what he's talking about there. And so Stanley Fish talks about interpretive communities. Stanley Fish is a literary professor, theorist, who says that people organize into groups where they share common interpretations of texts. And we create the text by the way we interpret it. Stanley Fish's famous action was to go into a classroom at one point to teach a class, and there was a bunch of things written on the board when he came in. And so he played with his students when they came into the class. He said that he had just written a poem and he wanted them to interpret the poem. And students wrote all of these complicated analyses of this poem that was there, which was really just a list of other things from another class that had just met in there. And then Fish had them argue with each other about whose interpretation of the poem was right. and they formed into groups where these 4 people agreed that this was the correct interpretation, and these 5 people agreed that this was the correct interpretation. So he developed this theory about how people create texts. Is that right, Laura? Do you know that story better than I do?
We talked about it one time.
Yeah.
It wasn't quite like that. You just said that. Alex.
That's all right. You don't have to do it.
I'm like,
But that's the rough idea, is that it was a random collection of words, and he managed to get his class to write deep interpretations of it and divide into groups about it.
we did it as a project. He gave it to us. We had to get it in groups.
Okay.
And figure out what it meant and then present it. And then he was like, "Oh, you guys were all wrong."
So did you have fish? Did you
No.
study with fish? No, or your professor did it? No.
We just had. It was like kind of like one of those the intro to college writing too.
Okay.
Our professor used that.
Yeah, yeah. So the whole idea of what does a text mean, or what does this series of words mean, is more systematic in our field than people who say, "Well, explain that to me," or "What's going on?" So a little journey out on hermeneutics there. What time is it? How long have we been at this?
It's 6:30.
We started at 5:30. We'll go another couple minutes, 10 minutes or so, and then we'll break. So Craig wants to keep pushing us back to practical problems. Practice. They're relevant to how we practice communication. So one of the things that's going to be important for you to manage, because you have a project in this class that is a practical problem. You need to connect with an organization, business, government agency, advocacy group, whatever, that has a communication problem. And then you're going to apply theory to that problem for them. So this is very connected to what we're doing. Because they will talk in ordinary ways about their problem. And that should clue you in on what some of the theoretical things are that you can deal with. All right, theory is relevant to practice. Okay, so these are important for Craig. People have common beliefs about communication. So what you bring to them has to be plausible. It has to make sense to them. It has to be insightful. People have to say, "Oh, I didn't think of it that way," or that's an interesting way to look at it. So you've got to be bringing something to the show, to the game. All right, so we'll pause on here for a minute. So he says rhetoric is plausible, believable, because everybody thinks you can learn to communicate better. That's a commonplace. We have hundreds of commonplaces about communication. Men don't understand women, or women don't understand men. That's a commonplace about communication. Or, men managers manage different than women managers. So there are some things that you say, yeah, that works. So I see how it's relevant. And it's interesting because it challenges common beliefs. So for instance, in this case, Craig is pointing out that we have a common place that we say the best communication is honest, straight from the heart, without any preparation. That's the best kind of communication that there is, right? That we privilege that kind of communication. Rhetoric says, no, it's not the best kind of communication. The best kind of communication is communication that takes into account the audience and reflects on that in shaping its message. So there's an argument, a tension there.
Yeah.
for students it says no winging.
No wing.
Except it always looks like I mean kill all birds.
No winging it, yeah. But this is a commonplace in our society. Don't think about it, don't give me, just let it come straight from your heart. And a rhetorician says, no.
I was gonna say, like, and maybe I could be wrong here, but kind of like a middle ground, like for everything. Like, I know when I was watching when the bridge collapsed, you know, and they had the mayor go on, and he was like came like very sincere, and whether, of course, it was like practice, but it had like the